For these people, and he's speaking of all those in the upper room, are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only 9 in the morning. Now, I'm going to pause there for a minute. This kind of cracks me up, because Peter was the very first one to do the very first sermon on the very first day of church, and he opens with a joke. He says, it's too early for them to be drunk, it's only 9. And I know this might not be very funny to you, but for me that's hilarious, because quite frankly, he's trying to get, God's got their attention and he's trying to keep it. He's being jovial. He's making a connection with them. When we are sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's imperative we make connections with people. Paul wrote, to the Jew, I became as the Jews, and the Greeks, I became as the Greeks. To those outside the law, I became as one outside of the law, though never breaking the law. To one who is of the law, I became as one of the law, though in the law of liberty. And you think about all this stuff, what's really wonderful and great about it. Paul ends his exposition on that with, I became all things to all men, that by all means I might save some. Jesus did it when he came on earth. He came down into the dirt with us, and he wonderfully related to us. He became flesh and bone with us. Here, Peter, when he is beginning to preach, is relating with people. We're not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 o'clock. How are you relating people when trying to share the gospel? I know we're going line by line, but this is so meaty, and I don't want to miss anything, which is why, I said beginning in Acts 14, because, quite frankly, I don't know how far we're going to be able to go with this. And so, let's take a look at that. So he goes on. On the contrary, and he gets serious here. He makes the connection, and he goes for the deep stuff. This is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. And it will be in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my Spirit on all humanity. Then your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. I will even pour out my Spirit on my male and female slaves in those days, and they will prophesy. I will display wonders in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and cloud and smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the great and remarkable day of the Lord comes. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Now, what Paul did here is pretty genius. When he's quoting from Joel, he's quoting directly Joel chapter 2, verses 28 to 32. Everybody would be familiar with this. In Joel's day, apart from maybe a couple secularists or whoever was the secular among the Jews, most Jewish people who were religious would know the scriptures backwards and forwards. They would know in their minds because they talked about it constantly. They were looking for Messiah through the scriptures. Now, of course, they had other things in their heads, such as what was called the Talmud, which today many call the Oral Torah, which it's not. The Talmud simply means commentary. But Peter was going right back to what they knew. He was proving Jesus Christ through the scriptures. A lot of people nowadays will say, when you share the gospel with somebody, don't use the scriptures. That's a bunch of bunk. Because the gospels are proven by the Old Testament scriptures. The gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus came and lived as a man, was in accordance to the scriptures. Go to 1 Corinthians 15. We've talked about that. That he was born of a virgin, according to the scriptures. That he lived a sinless life, according to the scriptures. That he was crucified and beaten and mocked, according to the scriptures. You think I'm wrong? Go to Psalm 22 and read the whole chapter. That he was killed and buried and rose on the third day, in accordance with the scriptures. And that, as Peter is saying here, God's Holy Spirit was poured out upon his church, according to the scriptures. We can prove Christ by the scriptures. And Paul writes this in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation for those who believe, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Loved ones, if we are going to prove Christ, we need to prove Christ by the scriptures. First, of course, make connections with people. Absolutely. Don't beat them over the head with the Bible. Absolutely. Because some people who may need milk are not ready for the meat you might want to give them. But here Paul knew his audience. Or Paul. I can do that with Peter and Paul often. Sorry. Here Peter knew his audience. The Holy Spirit knew the audience. These were God-fearing Jews who were in for the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Pentecost. And on this day, he knew that he had to prove by the Scriptures that Christ was who he said he was. This is important. And if you consider this, that same Holy Spirit that Joel preached hundreds of years before Christ, that same Holy Spirit that came upon those in the upper room was the same Holy Spirit that led Christ in his life and his ministry, the same one that alighted upon him as a dove when he was baptized. And Paul writes this, affirming these words that Peter says here on this first day of church. That same power that rose Jesus from the dead, meaning the Holy Spirit, lives also in you. And I'm going to say something here. We'll go on to this next section later, next week, as we go through this, but I want to say something about this. There are people who are claiming Jesus is not the Christ. There are people who claim that biblical prophecy, such as Revelation, we've got comments on that recently, it's not what it says it is. Here's the big thing. Church, if we do not know the Scriptures, and I'm not talking the New World Translation, which I'm sorry if you follow that, that is not a translation of the Bible that is accurate. It removes Scriptures and it changes Scriptures. Following things other than the Bible, we are going to get led astray by anything. If we do not know the Scriptures, and if we do not prove Christ through the Scriptures, if we do not stand upon the Scriptures, we're going to be led astray by anything. That's why prosperity gospel and certain cults have popped up around the church. That's why all these things occur around the church. Loved ones, we, as the church, need to know these Scriptures so the Holy Spirit can give us the right moment and the right thing to say, as he did on the Pentecost with Peter. That same Spirit that Peter is preaching about dwells within every believer of Jesus Christ. When you are born again, the Spirit of God lives in you. That's why your life changes and you don't even realize it. That's why it's not the work that we can do to please God, but the work that the Holy Spirit does in us in shaping and molding and chiseling away things that don't belong there. This is our God. So, loved ones, I want to challenge you today, as Peter did. Connect with people. Meet them where they're at. You hear someone crack a joke? Find a way to be witty and come on in and use that as an opportunity to preach the gospel. God is giving you an opportunity to use the gospel, prove Jesus Christ through the Scriptures. Allow the Holy Spirit to move. Peter and the 11 and those that were with them were moved by the Spirit and used by the Spirit. Be moved by the Spirit and used by the Spirit. It is not by your might or your power. It's not by your eloquence of words. Paul himself even stated that he didn't speak well. Moses stated he didn't speak well. Aaron spoke for him, but the Spirit of God was upon them and moved and used by them. And because of men like Moses and Paul who did not speak well, we are here. Because they were used of the Holy Spirit, used by God. Moses in planting the people of Israel and taking them to the promised land. Paul in planting the church all over. Peter in being bold and speaking up and beginning. We're going to look next week to see how his words were affected, how he used the Scriptures to prove Christ, how we also need to do that. But let this same Spirit that fell upon the believers on the day live boldly and richly in you. Submit completely to it. Watch how God uses the Holy Spirit, who itself, himself, I'm going to use his proper pronouns because that's his preferred ones. Stupid joke, I don't care, there it is. Use the Holy Spirit, who he dwells in you. Let him take over. Let him use you in all facets and aspects of your life. As you raise children, if you're a parent, as you're a spouse, if you're a husband or a wife, as you go to school, if you're a student, as you have friends, as you go to work, whatever it is God may do, let the Holy Spirit find that moment. Be full of the Holy Spirit and boldly proclaim the gospel in whatever capacity God has sent you to. This is how we begin to look like Jesus. By following that same Spirit that was in Jesus Christ, that same Spirit that was upon Peter and in Peter, that same Spirit that was on Paul, and the same Spirit that dwells in you today. I hope that makes sense. Let me know what you think about this. And here's what I'm going to say. Is prove it through the Scriptures. Prove it through the Scriptures. Let's reason through the Scriptures together. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'll admit it. I've done so before. Let's reason together through the Scriptures, and let's watch what God will do. I love you. I'm praying for you. Like, share, comment. Everything you do helps us get this message out. And God bless you. I love you, and I'm praying for you. And God willing, we'll see you on Thursday.